My son sat at the reading of the will wearing a smug, self-satisfied grin, so sure he was about to inherit everything from his late mother's $34 million estate. His arms were crossed, legs spread like a king surveying his conquered land. He didn't glance at me once. In his mind, I didn't exist. But when the lawyer cleared his throat and read one single sentence, the air shifted. To my son, Dustin Flores, I leave nothing. Silence, then fury. Dustin's smile vanished like smoke. His face turned crimson, and within seconds he was on his feet, screaming loud, guttural, animalistic. The mahogany-paneled walls of the attorney's office seemed to vibrate with the raw shock of his rage. The receptionist peeked in, startled. One intern dropped her pen. Me? I sat still, letting the moment settle. After all these years, justice didn't need to shout. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? That morning had started like any other. The coffee cup slipped from my fingers, shattering across the linoleum as Mrs. Henderson's shrill voice sliced through the paper-thin apartment walls. Your damn sprinklers are flooding my begonias again. Jerry? I sighed and reached for a dish towel, kneeling among the ceramic shards. 65 years old and still cleaning up messes. Some mine, most not. The new sprinkler system I'd installed had a faulty elbow joint, sending water spilling across the property line every third day. Eleanor Henderson, my neighbor, had the patience of a lit match in the volume of a fire alarm. Then the phone rang. I tried to ignore it. The machine would get it. But the ringing cut through Eleanor's rant about property values and inconsiderate tenants. By the fifth ring, I stood up, tossed the soaked towel into the sink, and picked up the receiver. Jerry Flores speaking. Mr. Flores, a voice answered, calm, firm, practiced. This is Janet Morrison from Morrison, Welsh & Associates in Cheyenne. I'm calling regarding Brianna Elizabeth Flores. My hand gripped the phone just a little tighter. I knew that tone. I'd heard it too many times. The kind of voice that always came before the world shifted. No one had called Brianna by her full name in front of me in over 15 years. Not since before the papers were signed. Not since the last time she said my name like it meant something. What about her? I asked, even though I already felt the answer forming like a cold knot in my chest. Sir, I'm very sorry to inform you. Mrs. Flores passed away Tuesday evening. The words hit harder than I expected, like a punch I didn't see coming. My knees gave out and I sank into the kitchen chair. It creaked beneath me, far too loud in the sudden stillness. Tuesday evening, that was 3 days ago. 3 whole days I'd spent mopping up coffee and arguing with Eleanor about her drenched begonias, while the woman I once shared a life with was being lowered into a morgue drawer. The funeral is scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m., Riverside Memorial Chapel. The line went quiet for a moment. Mr. Flores, are you still with me? Yes, I said, but my voice didn't sound like mine. It echoed, dull and far away. How did you get this number? Your name was listed in Mrs. Flores's personal effects. You were marked as her emergency contact. Emergency contact. The irony stung. I hadn't seen her in over a decade, and yet, when everything ended, it was still me she had written down. I understand you were previously married? Previously married, 22 years reduced to a checkbox on some legal document. Yes, I replied mechanically. We divorced in 2010. The words rolled off my tongue without emotion. Muscle memory from too many government forms and insurance claims. There will be a reading of the will following the service. You're named as a beneficiary, so your presence would be appreciated. Beneficiary? The word didn't land. It just floated there, foreign, untouchable. Brianna had rebuilt her life after me. She'd taken that tiny consulting business we started together in our garage and turned it into a multi-million-dollar empire. I'd watch from a distance, as most men do, when they realize too late what they helped build and then lost. What could she have possibly left me? Mr. Flores? I looked out the kitchen window where Eleanor Henderson stood ankle-deep in soggy soil, hands planted firmly on her hips in that familiar stance that meant I'd be getting an earful before lunch. Yes, I said, eyes still on Eleanor. I'll be there. But her voice, Eleanor's shrill complaints about begonias and broken sprinklers, sounded far away now, like it belonged to another dimension. Muffled, irrelevant. The chapel, I said slowly, the words catching in my throat. Which one did you say? Riverside Memorial, Grand Avenue, she replied, still in that measured professional cadence. Service begins at 2 p.m., followed by a brief reception. The will reading is scheduled for 4:30 at our offices downtown. I nodded, though she couldn't see me. I'll be there. When the call ended, I didn't move. I just sat there, still hunched over the phone, staring at it like it might ring again with a correction. A second chance. A do-over. The coffee had begun to soak in. Dark, ugly stains spreading slowly across the linoleum. Ordinary and permanent. I should have gotten up. Cleaned it. Done something. But I couldn't. Couldn't seem to move. Couldn't seem to accept that Brianna, vibrant, stubborn, brilliant Brianna, was gone. The late afternoon light slanted in through the kitchen blinds, golden and soft. It illuminated floating dust motes, tiny pieces of forgotten time, dancing lazily in the air, like the memories I'd spent years trying to bury. But now they clawed their way back. And then, just like that, I was somewhere else entirely. Murphy's Diner, a snowy February evening, 1987. I was 27, broke, tired, sitting in the corner booth with a lukewarm slice of apple pie and more regrets than dreams. And then she walked in, a red wool coat, black snow-scuffed boots. Her voice rang out clear across the restaurant, snapping me out of my fog. You're telling me you won't consider female applicants for weekend manager because women can't handle the pressure? That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard all week. The place was nearly empty, but her presence filled it, commanded it. She stood across from the manager, chin raised, back straight, eyes sharp. She wasn't yelling, she didn't need to. There was something in her voice, a weight, a fire, a refusal to be dismissed. I remember freezing mid-bite, fork suspended halfway to my mouth. She turned slightly, just enough for me to catch her profile, sharp cheekbones, determined jawline, dark curls catching in the fluorescence. She was magnificent in her fury, and I remember thinking, not consciously, not fully, I hope he keeps arguing. I just want to hear her talk a little longer. Ma'am, I didn't mean any offense. Of course you didn't, she replied smoothly. You just meant to discriminate. Her voice was sharp but not unkind, calm, controlled, the kind of composure that came from being right and knowing it. She reached into her purse, pulled out a business card, and slid it across the counter with 2 fingers. When you're ready to hire based on qualifications instead of outdated assumptions, call me. Then she turned, her heels clicking smartly against the tile floor. The door chimes jingled as she left, and it felt like the entire diner exhaled, like the air itself had lost its charge. I stared after her, watched through the foggy window as she climbed into a blue Honda Civic, one of those boxy ones with the fold-out windows in the back. She checked her mirrors, twice, then pulled into traffic, smooth, purposeful. She was careful, yes, but there was no hesitation in her, only precision. That one's trouble, the manager muttered, loud enough for the few remaining patrons to hear. I stood, pulled a crumpled 5 from my wallet, and left it beside the half-eaten pie. No, I said, more to myself than anyone else, surprised at the certainty in my voice. That one's extraordinary. The business card sat there on the counter, half forgotten. Brianna Chen, business consultant. I didn't take it. I didn't need to. I'd already memorized the number before stepping into the freezing February wind. It took me 3 days to call her. 3 days of pacing, of rehearsing fake openings and throwing them away. 3 days of excuses, bad sleep, and 1 phone call that almost happened before I chickened out halfway through dialing. When I finally did, she answered on the second ring. Brianna Chen, her voice was crisp, focused, just like I remembered. This is Jerry Flores. We haven't met technically. I saw you at Murphy's Diner on Friday night. A pause, then, the man with the apple pie who defended my honor to the manager? I blinked. You heard that? I was getting my gloves from the car, she said, amusement threading through her tone. You left a good tip, too. I could hear the smile in her voice, and suddenly everything felt a little warmer. So, Jerry Flores, what can I do for you? I hesitated for just a beat, then plunged in. Have dinner with me, somewhere better than Murphy's. A longer pause this time, the kind you feel in your chest. Are you asking me on a date, or do you need business consulting? Definitely a date, I said. Though if you have any advice on how to convince beautiful women to say yes to dinner with strangers, I'd happily take the consultation. She laughed, not a polite, obligatory chuckle, but a full, unrestrained laugh that caught me completely off guard. It was the kind of laugh that reached her eyes and lingered in the air long after the sound faded. Saturday night, she said, still smiling. Romano's on 3rd Street, 7 o'clock. Don't be late. She wore that same striking red coat to dinner, but underneath it was a sleek black dress that made my pulse stutter. Her hair was swept up with just enough pieces left loose to feel effortless. We talked for 3 hours about childhood summers in California, my uneventful job at the power plant, her plans to grow her business, and our shared obsession with old black and white movies and the smell of secondhand bookstores. Not once did we talk about consulting or clients or resumes. When she laughed again, this time at my story about flooding the kitchen while trying to fix a leaky faucet, something shifted. I wasn't just interested. I was gone, smitten, completely undone. 6 months later, I proposed, not with flash or ceremony, but in the exact spot where I'd first seen her, Murphy's Diner. I slid a simple gold ring across the same worn counter where she'd once left her business card. Marry me, Brianna Chen, I said. Make me the luckiest man in Wyoming. She said yes before I'd even finished the sentence. Our wedding was bathed in golden September light, the kind of afternoon where the sky feels too perfect to be real and everything smells like promises. Brianna wore her grandmother's vintage gown, lovingly altered to fit her slimmer frame. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers we'd picked together that morning. Chaotic, beautiful, and somehow exactly right. My hands trembled as I slid the ring onto her finger. Forever, she whispered, and I believed her with every cell in my body. Dustin came along 2 years later, a red-faced, howling miracle who turned our peaceful little house into a whirlwind of bottles, toys, and wonder. I remember standing in the hospital, watching Brianna cradle him in her arms. She looked at him the same way she looked at business problems, with total focus and fierce determination, like loving him was a mission she'd been preparing for her entire life. Even then, though, even in that perfect, glowing moment, I noticed how her eyes kept drifting toward the business magazine someone had left on the nightstand, just for a second or two. But it was enough to remind me, Brianna had dreams that stretched far beyond any nursery. But as Dustin grew from a babbling toddler into a curious schoolboy, the perfect picture began to blur. Small things at first, the way Brianna's gaze lingered over quarterly reports longer than bedtime stories, or how our calendar filled with client dinners instead of family outings. When Dustin turned 7, she bought him a computer. Not one of those kid-friendly plastic models with oversized buttons, a real machine, sleek and powerful, worth more than my entire monthly paycheck. He needs to understand technology, she told me, watching with quiet satisfaction as our son clicked through programs I couldn't even pronounce. The future belongs to kids who think digitally. I remember suggesting something simpler. Maybe I'll take him fishing this weekend. She laughed, not in amusement, but in mild disdain. Jerry, fish aren't going to help him get ahead. By then, we'd already moved to Hillcrest Avenue, a neighborhood with gates at the entrance and landscaping crews that came every Thursday. Our new house had 3 bathrooms, 2 fireplaces, and a kitchen island bigger than our first living room. Brianna's consulting firm had just secured a lucrative contract with a mining consortium, and suddenly we were living in a world I didn't recognize or entirely understand. A housekeeper showed up twice a week. Our stainless steel fridge dispensed crushed ice and filtered water with the push of a button. Dustin's room was overflowing with the kind of gadgets and games I would have begged for as a kid. Isn't this wonderful? Brianna beamed one evening, gesturing proudly around the new dining room. The crystal chandelier sparkled above a 12-seat table so polished it practically glowed. We can finally entertain properly. But I missed the old kitchen, the tiny table with mismatched chairs, the burn mark from a failed science experiment, the grooves worn into the wood by years of Dustin's crayons and our late-night conversations. That scratched-up table had held our life. This new one reflected everything. Light, ambition, fingerprints. It demanded coasters and silence. The entertaining began immediately. Wine glasses clinked. Laughter floated down the hallway from rooms I didn't feel welcome in. Consultants, investors, powerful people with shiny shoes and louder opinions. I stood at the edge of it all, smiling politely, refilling drinks, pretending not to notice how my wife glowed more for her colleagues than for me. Business associates, potential clients, polished couples who talked in fluent financial jargon, market share, investment portfolios, scalable growth. I'd wear my best shirt, smile when appropriate, and try to follow the conversations. But every mention of hedge funds or corporate restructuring made me feel like a tourist in a country I hadn't prepared for. Jerry works at the power plant, Brianna would offer when someone inevitably asked. But her voice had changed. The pride I remembered was gone, replaced by something quieter, thinner, apologetic almost, as if my job, the job that paid our mortgage for a decade, needed to be excused. Dustin thrived in this new world. At 10, he could talk programming with Brianna's tech-savvy clients. At 12, he critiqued wine menus in restaurants I wouldn't dare enter alone. By 14, he rolled his eyes at my suggestions of family camping trips, brushing them off in favor of Brianna's business conferences in Denver or Salt Lake City. Dad doesn't understand. It became his refrain, delivered with the sigh of someone too worldly for things like fishing poles and campfires. The first real fight came on his 15th birthday. Brianna had organized an event that felt more like a networking mixer than a party. Catered food, hired entertainment, a guest list heavy with clients and their equally polished children. I'd wanted something simpler, a barbecue, some burgers in the backyard, a few school friends, maybe a football, something real, something his. This is ridiculous, I said the night before, watching servers arrange centerpieces that cost more than my monthly truck payment. He's 15, Brianna, not 50. She didn't look up, just adjusted a floral display like it was another line item in a proposal. He's growing up in a different world than we did, Jerry, she said, her tone clipped. These connections matter. These relationships will shape his future. And what about just being a kid? I asked. This time she looked at me, really looked. And in that moment, something in her eyes chilled me. Not anger, not frustration, but distance, like she'd already moved on from that version of life. From campfires and scraped knees and backyard birthdays, and left me standing alone in it. Calculation, where there used to be warmth. Being just a kid is a luxury we can't afford to give him, Brianna said. The world is competitive. Either we prepare him to win, or we prepare him to lose. I thought about my own 15th birthday, fishing with my dad, a lopsided cake baked by my mom, gifts wrapped in the Sunday funnies. It wasn't lavish, but it was real, and it was enough. The party, by Brianna's standards, was a glowing success. Dustin dazzled the adults with polished charm. Their children brought gifts that whispered wealth, high-end laptops, designer labels, a mountain bike that cost more than my first car. But I saw him just once, standing alone by the pool. Still, silent, out of place in the middle of his own birthday. "You okay, buddy?" I asked. He straightened like a soldier snapping to attention, slipping the mask back on. Of course. Why wouldn't I be? But for that brief moment, I'd glimpsed the little boy underneath all the polish. Confused, overwhelmed, maybe even sad. And it cracked something deep inside me. That party was the beginning of the end. I didn't see it clearly then, not all at once. But what followed was 10 years of slow-motion collapse, like watching a landslide from the valley below. Inevitable, devastating, and entirely out of my control. Brianna's business became everything. It swallowed her time, her focus, her spirit. Family dinners gave way to conference calls. Vacations disappeared under the weight of client emergencies. Dustin's school events went up against board meetings, and the meetings always won. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," she'd snap when I dared to object. "This business supports our lifestyle. Someone has to make the hard choices." But I did understand pressure, the kind that came from keeping a city's lights on, from making sure strangers could cook dinner, charge their phones, stay warm in a snowstorm. My pressure served something beyond myself. Hers served ambition, image, control. By the time Dustin graduated high school, he was a stranger, polite, well-dressed, articulate, and utterly unfamiliar. Brianna had groomed Dustin into her perfect project, sharp, ambitious, and dismissive of anything that didn't serve his upward trajectory. When I suggested he look at trade schools alongside college applications, he stared at me like I'd asked him to become a medieval serf. "Dad, that kind of thinking is exactly why you're stuck. 17 years old, already talking like a consultant. You settled for mediocrity. I won't make that mistake." The words landed like punches. Mediocrity, as if 25 years of keeping the lights on for an entire town meant nothing. As if showing up every day as a father, steady and present, was something to be ashamed of. College made it worse. He picked business school, Brianna's alma mater, of course, and came home on holidays full of buzzwords: market dynamics, scalability, personal optimization. He looked around our house, at me, like I was a failed prototype. "You could have done more, Dad." Like being content was some kind of character flaw. "Mom started with nothing and built an empire. You've had the same job for 20 years. Some things matter more than money," I told him. But he was already gone, at least in spirit. Eyes on the next deal, next goal, next version of success. The breaking point came during his senior year. Brianna was deep in a high-stakes acquisition, working 100-hour weeks. I kept the home running: groceries, laundry, bills, the invisible glue that holds life together. Then came Dustin's graduation. She missed it. "A client crisis," she said. That night at midnight, she stood in our polished kitchen, crystal and granite gleaming around her like trophies. Still in her blazer, phone in hand, scrolling through emails. And I said it. Finally. "This is enough, Brianna. Family has to come first. Sometimes." She didn't even look up. "Don't lecture me about priorities," she snapped. "Everything we have, everything Dustin's achieved, is because of my work." "And what about everything we've lost?" I asked. That made her pause, just for a second. "Like what?" She looked up then, really looked, and I saw it in her eyes before she said a word. "Like us," I said quietly. "Like being a family instead of a corporation." She stared at me, her phone now idle in her hand. No emails, no meetings, just silence. And then I heard it, not in her words, but in her stillness. We weren't a family anymore. We were a business arrangement, and like any contract past its expiration date, it had simply stopped being useful. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending this is working," she said quietly. The divorce took 6 months. Brianna's lawyers were efficient, clinical, and devastating. I walked away with the house on Maple Street, our old starter home she kept as a rental property, and just enough money to live modestly. She got everything else, including Dustin. His loyalty wasn't even a question. "You're holding him back too," he told me in one of our last real conversations, just before moving to Denver to work for her firm. "All this guilt about family values and simple living, it's toxic, Dad. I can't be around that kind of negativity anymore." Negativity, that's what it was to him now. The life I'd tried to build, the love I'd given, the dinners, the baseball games, the nights spent helping with homework. I sat alone in the house afterward, surrounded by boxes full of memories from a life that apparently had meant nothing to the people I'd loved most. 15 years later, I was sitting in my small apartment as the afternoon light began to fade through the window. My coffee had gone cold. The ceramic shards from the mug I dropped still lay scattered on the floor. Somewhere across town, Funeral preparations were underway for the woman who'd once promised me forever, and I still had no idea why she'd remembered my name in her will. The 3 days between Janet Morrison's phone call and the funeral passed in a kind of suspended quiet, like holding your breath underwater. I cleaned the apartment twice, pressed my one good suit, rehearsed conversations I knew would never happen. Each morning I thought about not going, but each evening I found myself still committed to showing up, to say goodbye, whatever that meant now. Friday morning arrived gray and cold. Typical May weather in Wyoming. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie I hadn't worn in 5 years, wondering what Brianna would think of the man staring back at her now. The reflection showed someone older than I felt inside. Silver hair where brown used to be. A map of quiet disappointments etched across my face. The drive to Riverside Memorial Chapel took 20 minutes. My route passed through a city that told its own story, of economic divides and shifting loyalties. My modest apartment complex gave way to neat subdivisions, then to the sprawling estates and manicured lawns of Brianna's world, stone facades, triple garages, and lives built around image. The chapel sat on a hill overlooking Rock Springs, its Gothic architecture radiating permanence, power, and prosperity. Cars lined the circular driveway, Mercedes sedans, BMWs, a fleet of Teslas that probably cost more than my best year on the grid ever earned. I parked my 15-year-old Honda between a Lexus and a Cadillac, and as I stepped out, buttoning my jacket, I couldn't shake the feeling. I wasn't attending a funeral. I was trespassing on someone else's legacy. Inside, the chapel whispered wealth, not loudly, but confidently. Mahogany pews, stained glass windows, floral arrangements so precise, they looked more like art installations than condolences. I took a seat in the very back. Not out of shame, out of understanding. I knew exactly where I stood in the story now. At least 200 people filled the chapel, their murmured conversations forming a low hum, part mourning, part business networking. I recognized a few faces from the dinners Brianna used to drag me to back when we were still married, but most were strangers, fixtures from the empire she built after I was gone. I slipped into a back pew, hoping to remain invisible, but silence is never truly silent when you don't belong. Whispers followed me like ripples in still water. A woman in a sleek black suit nudged her companion and tilted her chin in my direction. Her ex-husband. Can you believe he showed up after everything he put her through? The stories had grown their own legs over the years. In the version people preferred, I was the villain, the man who clipped the wings of a brilliant woman, the dead weight she had to shed to soar. I'd learned long ago not to argue with a narrative that made other people feel better. Then I heard it. Dad. The voice cut through the hum like a blade. I looked up. Dustin was striding down the aisle, his expression hard and unreadable, a mix of disbelief and barely restrained fury. He was 37 now. Brianna's features carved into his face, her confidence in every step, a tailored suit, a designer watch, a haircut that cost more than my groceries. He radiated success and resentment. What are you doing here? His voice echoed through the chapel, sharp enough to turn heads and silence conversations. I rose slowly, steadying myself before answering. I came to pay my respects. You lost the right to do that 15 years ago. He moved in closer, close enough that I could smell the cologne, something cold, expensive, like ambition in a bottle. She wouldn't have wanted you here, he said. I held his gaze. Maybe not. But I needed to be, he scoffed. For what? To ease your conscience? To play the grieving widower for people who know exactly what kind of husband you were? The chapel had fallen completely silent. 200 mourners, now an audience, watching us like spectators at a prize fight. I could feel it. The same suffocating pressure I used to feel in the last years of my marriage. That invisible weight of judgment. But something had shifted. This time, I had nothing left to lose. I'm not here to cause trouble, Dustin, I said quietly. I'll sit in the back. I won't speak to anyone. When the service ends, I'll leave. No, he snapped. You'll leave now. His voice rose, sharp and commanding. A few murmurs of approval echoed around the room. like a courtroom audience rallying behind the prosecution. "You embarrassed her enough when she was alive," he added. "Don't compound it by pretending to grieve her death." I stayed where I was, meeting his eyes, refusing to shrink. The room pulsed with tension. Someone coughed. A phone buzzed quietly against polished wood. Then Dustin turned from me to the chapel, his voice growing louder, clearer, projecting authority like someone used to being listened to. "I apologize for the disruption," he said. "This should be a time for remembrance." He motioned toward me with a flick of his hand, like brushing away an insect. "My father seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family." A few people nodded. I heard a whispered, "That's right," from somewhere near the front. The heat rose in my cheeks, but I held steady, silent. Dustin continued, now in full stride. A performer, a prosecutor, a son reshaping a legacy in real time. "For those of you who don't know," he said, turning back to the crowd, "this is Jerry Flores, the man who spent 22 years holding back one of the most brilliant women Rock Springs has ever produced. While my mother was building an empire, creating jobs, reshaping industries, he was content to punch a clock and complain about her ambitions. Dustin, that's enough." My voice came out sharper than I meant it to, edged with pain I hadn't planned to show. He ignored me. "I think these people deserve the truth," he said, turning back to his impromptu audience. He took half her assets in the divorce, despite contributing nothing to her success. The room seemed to lean in, and for a moment I felt like a stranger at my own life's funeral. "Then he spent 15 years acting like the victim," Dustin continued, "while she built something magnificent." The crowd was fully with him now. Nods, tight-lipped expressions of approval, faces I recognized, former neighbors, colleagues, people who once ate at our table. None of them met my eyes. "She supported him for years," Dustin pressed on, "while he refused to grow, refused to take risks, refused to be the partner she deserved." His voice had the sharp edge of righteous fury, and still, I stood there, silent, every word landing like a punch, not because they were lies, but because they carved our 22 years of marriage into a cruel, convenient myth, a story with only one villain. And it was betrayal. I considered speaking, defending myself, explaining that love isn't always enough, that ambition and simplicity sometimes collide and leave both people aching. But I knew better. These people had chosen their narrative long ago. "My mother died building something that will outlast all of us," Dustin declared, his voice rising with conviction. "She deserved a husband who would have helped her reach those heights, not one who tried to drag her down to his level." Silence fell, the kind that echoes in your chest. 200 people stared at me, some with pity, most with disdain. Part of me wanted to walk out, to disappear, but another part, the part that had once loved Brianna Chen more than his own breath, refused to be chased from her final goodbye. I looked at my son, really looked. And then I asked quietly, "Are you finished?" His eyes flickered, surprised. He'd expected me to retreat, to slink away in shame, but I remained standing. And in that moment, I saw his confidence waver, just slightly. "I loved your mother for 40 years, I said, 22 of them as her husband, 18 more as someone who wished her well, despite everything that came between us." My voice carried through the chapel, steady, clear, no anger, no defense, just truth. I'm not here to make claims or demand recognition. I'm here because, once upon a time, we made promises to each other. And I choose to honor those promises, even if I'm the only one who remembers. I sat back down, folded my hands in my lap. Around me the silence stretched, uncomfortable, heavy, real. And in that silence, no one said a word. Dustin stood frozen in the aisle, clearly unprepared for resistance to his public trial. He had delivered his verdict and expected no rebuttal. "The service will begin in 5 minutes, someone announced from the front of the chapel, likely the funeral director, trying to reclaim control of his carefully choreographed event. Dustin shot me one final look, not grief, not sorrow, contempt. Then he turned and strode toward the front pew, the one reserved for family. As murmurs returned to the room, I caught the scattered whispers, slivers of conversation floating past like ash. The nerve of some people. Poor Dustin having to deal with that. Should have stayed home. But I stayed. I stayed through the eulogy that painted Brianna as a visionary, a woman who had battled obstacles and won. Through the testimonials from business associates who spoke of her brilliance, her leadership, her ability to command rooms and reshape industries. I sat through the musical selections, each one a crescendo of triumph, of endurance, of conquering the odds. Not a single mention of her heart, not a word about her laughter, or the way she used to sing to Dustin as a boy when he couldn't sleep. When it was over, people filed past her casket, offering condolences to Dustin, deliberately avoiding me. I waited until most of the chapel had emptied, until the weight of so many eyes had lifted. Then I rose to leave. Mr. Flores? A man in an expensive suit stepped into my path. Middle-aged, professional, polished, a leather briefcase in one hand, sympathy not quite reaching his eyes. Dan Morrison, from Morrison Welsh and Associates. May I have a word? I blinked. Of course. Even now, even here, there were still meetings, still agendas. As the final hymn faded and the funeral director stepped forward with closing remarks, the old familiar exhaustion settled over me like a heavy coat. The ordeal was nearly over. In a few more minutes, I could slip out through the side door, drive back to my quiet apartment, and try to forget this whole humiliating chapter. Around me, the subtle rustling began. People gathering purses, programs, their silence cracking into polite chatter. Up front, Dustin stood in the center of it all, accepting condolences with the poise of a man who had long since mastered the art of being the center of attention. A few people glanced my way, but most had already filed me under irrelevant. A footnote in the story of the day. I was reaching for my jacket, just moments from escape, when a voice stopped me cold. T. Mr. Flores? Dan Morrison approached with deliberate, measured steps. His suit was impeccable, untouched by the heat or the length of the ceremony. Up close, he looked younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the quiet confidence of a man used to managing the lives of the wealthy. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, extending a hand. Dan Morrison, Morrison Welsh and Associates. We spoke briefly after the service. I shook his hand, firm grip, steady gaze, no wasted words. The service was very nice, I offered. Brianna would have appreciated it. Indeed, he nodded. She was quite specific about her final arrangements. He glanced around the nearly empty chapel, then lowered his voice. I wonder if I might have a word with you and Dustin. There are matters regarding Mrs. Flores' estate that require discussion. Before I could respond, Dustin appeared at my shoulder. His face shifted instantly, from curated sorrow to sharp interest. Dan, finally, I was wondering when we'd get to the business side of things. Of course, Dustin, Dan replied smoothly, his voice calm and professional, like a surgeon preparing to make the first cut. These matters require careful attention. I'd like both of you to come to my office for the reading of your mother's will. Dustin blinked. Both of us? His brow furrowed in confusion or irritation. Is that necessary? I mean, he's not... He waved a hand toward me, dismissive. Dan didn't flinch. Your father is specifically named in the will, Dustin. His presence is required by law. The words landed like a small explosion. Named in the will. That didn't sound right. Not after everything. Not after the silence. More likely a footnote, I told myself. A formality. A clause to close a chapter. I don't think that's necessary, I said quietly. I'm sure it's just a formality. You don't need me there. Dan's gaze held mine, steady and firm. I'm afraid I do, Mr. Flores. Mrs. Flores was very specific about who should be present. You and Dustin must both attend. There was something in his voice, a finality, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of surprise beneath the professionalism. Dustin let out a short breath, irritated, but then he shrugged, the way only someone sure of their place in the world can. Fine, let's get this over with. Then to me, the sneer barely concealed. Try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be. The walk to Dan's office was only 3 blocks, but it felt longer. We passed through the heart of downtown Rock Springs, past brick storefronts and buildings that had watched the town's fortunes rise and fall with the pulse of the energy industry. No one spoke, not a word. The only sounds were our footsteps and the quiet hum of questions building in my chest. Dan filled the silence with professional small talk. The weather, the turnout, carefully chosen observations that revealed absolutely nothing about what lay ahead. He was practiced, polished. His office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian house. Dark wood, leather-bound books. Every surface whispered prestige and control. Framed certificates and diplomas lined the walls, interrupted only by photographs of Dan standing beside mayors, judges, and business elites. It was exactly the kind of office Brianna would have chosen. Successful but not flashy, elegant but grounded in tradition. "Please have a seat." Dan gestured toward 2 leather chairs in front of his mahogany desk. Dustin slid into the one closest to him without hesitation, leaving me the chair just slightly off to the side. A perfect metaphor for my place in all of this. Peripheral, present, but barely. Dan took his place behind the desk, his movements precise as he opened a thick folder and extracted several legal documents, handling them like sacred texts. The afternoon light slanted in through tall windows, casting a golden haze across the room. Dust motes floated in the silence, tiny spirits suspended in still air. "Before we begin," Dan said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to offer my condolences again. Brianna was not just a valued client, she was a friend. Her loss is deeply felt by all who knew her." Dustin nodded solemnly, the picture of respectful grief. I stayed silent. What could I say? What's expected from a man whose love was history and whose presence felt more like an intrusion than a comfort? Dan lifted the top document, several pages thick, bound in blue. He cleared his throat. "This is the last will and testament of Brianna Elizabeth Flores, executed on March 15, 2024, and properly witnessed according to Wyoming state law. It supersedes all previous wills and codicils." I blinked. 14 months ago. So recent. Had she been ill? Had something happened to make her stare down the barrel of her own mortality? Dan continued, voice steady. "The will confirms that Mrs. Flores was of sound mind and disposing memory when these documents were prepared, and that she was under no undue influence or coercion." The words fell into the room like slow, deliberate drops, each one pushing us closer to whatever came next. I glanced sideways at Dustin. He sat tall, relaxed. He already knew how this story ended, but I didn't. Not yet. Dan's voice took on that slow, deliberate rhythm reserved for legal proceedings, each word carefully chosen, every syllable crystal clear. Dustin leaned forward, hands clasped like a man preparing to receive his crown. You could see it in his posture, expectation, entitlement, victory just within reach. Dan turned to the next page, the afternoon sun catching the rim of his reading glasses as he continued in that same professional cadence. "I hereby make the following specific bequests and devices." His voice was steady, unemotional. "To my beloved son, Dustin Michael Flores, I leave the family home at 847 Hillrest Avenue, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein." Dustin smiled, not wide, but deep. The kind of smile that comes when you get exactly what you were expecting. The Hillrest house, easily worth $800,000. Mountain views, expansive space, perfect for hosting the powerful and impressing the ambitious. Dan didn't pause. Additionally, I bequeathed to Dustin the sum of $500,000 to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate. $500,000, plus the house. It was a king's ransom to most people. And yet, I watched closely as Dustin's smile faltered, just slightly, the corners of his mouth twitching with restrained confusion. He was pleased, yes, but he was also doing math. Big math, because Brianna's empire wasn't worth just a house and a lump sum. There was more, there had to be. Where was the business? The real money? That's wonderful, of course. Dustin said. But his voice wavered, a thin veil of gratitude covering a growing sense of unease. But what about Mom's business interests? The company? Dan didn't flinch. He simply lifted the next page. I'm continuing with the specific bequest, Dustin. Please allow me to finish. I shifted in my chair, suddenly hyper-aware of how out of place I was, a witness to someone else's legacy being handed over, a bystander to generational wealth I'd never touch. $500,000. The house, it was more than I'd seen in several lifetimes, and for Dustin, it was merely the opening act. He was Brianna's son, her protege, her heir in every way that mattered. But then, Dan spoke again, this time with a different weight to his words. The bequest to Dustin Michael Flores includes the following conditions. Dustin stiffened. Conditions? The word hit the room like a crack in glass. The inheritance is contingent upon his continued employment with Flores Consulting Solutions for a minimum of 2 years following the execution of this will, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. Now, Dustin didn't just look confused. He looked blindsided. Wait, conditions? What kind of conditions? And what do you mean, until the company is sold? Who would sell it? Dan didn't raise his voice. He simply met Dustin's eyes, calm and unyielding. I'm reading the will exactly as it was written. These are your mother's instructions, not mine. And for the first time all day, Dustin wasn't the one in control. A new kind of silence settled over the room. Not peaceful, not respectful. This was the silence of attention. Tight, waiting, coiled like a spring. Even Dustin felt it. His once confident posture shifted, his hands unclenching, then nervously gripping each other again in his lap. Across from them, I caught myself leaning forward, despite every intention I had to remain just a quiet observer. Then Dustin spoke, and his tone had changed. Let me get this straight, he said, that familiar edge creeping into his voice. The same one I'd heard back at the chapel, right before things began to unravel. I get the house, I get the $500,000, but there are strings attached? And now you're saying something about the company being sold? That doesn't make sense. Mom would never sell the company. It was her life's work. Dan didn't answer right away. Instead, he removed his glasses with deliberate care and began to clean them. A practiced pause, giving space for what he knew was coming. When he placed them back on, his gaze moved slowly between us, measured, neutral, but with something else behind it, something I couldn't quite place. Your mother's will, he said quietly, contains additional provisions, which address the disposition of her remaining assets, the company, her investment portfolio, and several other significant holdings. Dustin's jaw tensed. Then let's hear it, he snapped. What are these other provisions? The tension in the room ticked up a notch. Even I felt it now, a creeping unease settling in my chest. Dan's voice remained calm, but there was a shift, a softening, like a physician preparing to deliver a diagnosis no one wanted to hear. Before I continue, Dan said, settling back into his leather chair, I want to emphasize this. These documents represent Mrs. Flores' final considered wishes. They were prepared after extensive consultation, and she was adamant about their contents. A beat of silence, just the quiet tick, tick, tick of an antique clock on the shelf behind him. Dustin stared at Dan now, not with defiance, but with something that looked dangerously close to fear. And I began to wonder why Brianna had asked me to be here at all. This wasn't about legal formality. It wasn't even about inheritance anymore. Something deeper was unfolding, something intentional. Dan turned the third page, his eyes flicked over the lines. And when he looked up again, his voice carried the finality of a verdict. However, ma'am, he said, and that one word hit like a hammer, there are additional provisions that fundamentally alter the distribution of Mrs. Flores' estate. Dan lifted his reading glasses, and for the first time since we entered his office, his eyes met mine. Not just a glance, a deliberate, direct look, and something in his expression made my stomach twist. Sympathy, obligation. A quiet signal that what I was about to hear was not just unexpected, it was earth-shattering. Then his voice dropped, lower, heavier, deliberate. The will contains provisions for the disposition of Mrs. Flores's remaining assets. A pause. Which constitute the majority of her estate. Dustin leaned forward like a man watching a fuse burn down to nothing. His fingers gripped the armrests of his chair until his knuckles turned white. Finally, he muttered, let's hear about the company and the rest of her investments. Dan returned to the document, clearing his throat with the slow, purposeful breath of someone about to drop a bomb. To my former husband, Jerry Michael Flores, his words dropped into the room like stones into still water. I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. The number didn't land. It detonated. $33.5 million. The air seemed to leave my lungs. My mouth opened involuntarily, like my body was trying to reject what it couldn't comprehend. $33.5 million? I managed to speak, barely. Did you say 33 million? 33.5. Dan confirmed, his tone steady. But behind the calm, I saw it in his eyes. Not surprise, but the quiet vigilance of a man watching chaos take shape. Dustin had gone pale, then flushed red, as if his body couldn't decide whether to disappear or explode. What did you just say? He hissed. Dan didn't stop. Additionally, as he said, his voice unwavering, I transferred to Jerry Flores controlling interest in Flores Consulting Solutions, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings, and business assets. No sound, just the sudden pressure in my ears, like the world had gone underwater. This transfer includes 65% ownership of all corporate entities and appointment as chairman of the board of directors. I couldn't breathe. The room tilted, not metaphorically, literally tilted, as if gravity had just changed its mind, controlling interest in her company, the empire I had watched her build from nothing, the business that tore us apart, the machine that had made her rich and left me feeling small. And now she was giving it all to me. This can't be right, I whispered, barely audible even to myself. There must be a mistake. Dan took off his glasses again, cleaning them with calm, surgical precision. There is no error, Mr. Flores, he said gently. These documents were prepared under Mrs. Flores's direct supervision. She reviewed every word. These were her exact, confirmed wishes. The chair slammed against the wall behind Dustin as he stood, violently. No, this is impossible. She couldn't. His gaze snapped to me, and for the first time all day, I saw what lay beneath his confidence. Disbelief, betrayal, and something darker still. Something that looked a lot like hate. What did you do? Dustin's voice cracked like a whip across the room. How did you manipulate her? I flinched. I didn't do anything, I said. But even to my own ears, my voice sounded too small, too uncertain to stand against the fury building in front of me. I haven't spoken to your mother in 15 years. The words weren't enough. 15 years? Dustin shouted. People don't just give away $33 million to their ex-husbands for no reason. You must have gotten to her, convinced her when she was sick, when she wasn't thinking straight. Dan's voice cut through the storm like steel through silk, cool, practiced, final. I can assure you, he said, Mrs. Flores was of completely sound mind when she executed these documents. She underwent a full mental competency evaluation at her own request to prevent any legal challenge to the will's validity. Still, I couldn't move. My hands gripped the arms of my chair like a lifeline. I watched it all, Dustin's rage, Dan's calm, like I was watching from underwater. 33.5 million, control of a company I once resented and now owned. None of it made sense. But why? The word escaped from me like a breath I didn't know I was holding. Why would she do this? Dan carefully stacked the pages of the will like he was laying bricks over a grave. Then he looked up. Mrs. Flores left specific instructions regarding that question, Mr. Flores. She asked me to deliver a personal message to you once these provisions had been read. That broke something in Dustin. His face twisted, betrayal and heartbreak tangled into a snarl. A personal message? He spat. She left him a message, but cut me out of everything that actually matters. Dan remained unshaken. You received a substantial inheritance, Dustin. $500,000 in a valuable property represent more wealth than most people will ever see. Compared to what he's getting? Dustin pointed at me, his finger trembling with fury. You're talking about hundreds of millions. The company alone is worth more than everything else combined. The air felt thick, so dense with tension it was hard to breathe. Somewhere in the chaos of my mind, I realized my entire life had just been torn from its axis and hurled into a universe I didn't recognize. And all I could focus on was the impossible truth that Brianna, driven, brilliant, furious Brianna, had chosen to give me everything. And that's when Dustin snapped. "This is fraud," he screamed, his voice splintering with rage. Criminal fraud. She was manipulated, coerced, mentally compromised. He spun toward me, eyes wild, face red, every muscle in his body vibrating with fury. "You did something to her," he accused. "There's no other explanation." I shrank back in my chair, chilled to my bones by the violence in his voice. "Dustin, I swear to you, I had no contact with your mother. I didn't even know she was sick." "Liar!" His palms slammed down on Dan's desk, papers scattering like startled birds. Nobody gives away everything they've built to someone who abandoned them. Someone who couldn't even be bothered to call when she was dying. I felt something rise inside me. Not anger, not defense, but sorrow. "She didn't abandon anyone," I said quietly, finding a small pocket of strength. "Our marriage ended. That doesn't mean she stopped caring." "Don't give me that," Dustin shouted. "You walked away from us. You took your pathetic little settlement and disappeared into your pathetic little life while she built an empire. And now you want me to believe she just handed it all over to you?" Dan's voice rang out again, calm, unwavering, a command cloaked in civility. "Mr. Flores, Dustin, I understand this is difficult news, but I must insist you control yourself. These are your mother's clearly stated wishes," Dan said firmly, executed with full legal authority. Dustin turned toward him like a storm brewing. His eyes burned with betrayal. "I want every document examined, every signature, every evaluation. I want to know every single time this man," he pointed at me like I was filth, "had any contact with my mother in the last 5 years. Dan didn't even blink. There were no contacts, none. Mrs. Flores made that very clear when she explained her decision. That word, explained, was a match to dry timber. Dustin let out a cold, joyless laugh. "So she explained it, huh? She explained why she decided to stab her only son in the back and hand everything over to the man who destroyed her first marriage?" Dan nodded calmly. "She left a personal message. For your father." The word father hit like a sledgehammer. Dustin recoiled. Just for a second, his mask cracked, and behind the fury was something raw, something aching. Then the fire came roaring back. "He's not my father," Dustin hissed. "My father would have been there when she needed him. He would have supported her dreams, not tried to dim them just because he couldn't keep up." He turned to me, and I saw it. Years of resentment boiling just under his skin. "You're nothing but a failure. A small, bitter man who couldn't stand being married to someone better than him." Each word was a dagger, not because they were lies, but because they carried the sting of partial truth. And he knew it. I had felt it. The shrinking, the insecurity. Watching Brianna soar while I remained grounded. No man likes to feel irrelevant in his own marriage. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly. "Maybe I wasn't the husband she deserved. But I never asked for this. I never expected it." Dustin scoffed. "Expected? You orchestrated this. Somehow, somewhere along the way, you got to her when she was sick, scared, vulnerable." "That's enough," Dan snapped. For the first time, his voice lost its calm edge. Mrs. Flores was neither sick nor vulnerable. She was lucid, sharp, more clear-headed than I've ever seen her. This wasn't the act of a woman under pressure. This was a chosen. Dustin's voice cracked. Then why? His composure finally gave way. Why would she do this to me? I gave her everything. I worked for her company. I lived the life she planned for me. I became the son she could be proud of. For a moment, the courtroom, the tension, even the money, all of it fell away. And what I saw was just a man, her son, broken. All he'd ever wanted was her approval. And now she had given her final, irreversible validation to someone else. Me. Dan's voice softened. She left a message, explaining her reasoning. Would you like me to read it? Dustin didn't answer right away. His hands were trembling. His chest heaved as if the weight of it all was finally pressing down. A message! He repeated the word like a curse. She couldn't say it to my face, but she left a message. For him. Dan paused. The message was for both of you. She wrote it to be read after the will was executed. I finally found my voice. Low, cracked, barely more than a whisper. Maybe we should hear what she had to say. Dustin's eyes locked onto mine, a storm of hatred. You have no right to make decisions, no right to any of this. But even as he spit the words, I saw it, the desperation in his gaze. He needed this. He needed to understand why his mother had chosen to shatter everything he believed about her and about himself. Dan was already moving, reaching for a sealed envelope marked in Brianna's unmistakable cursive. Personal message. He raised one hand, commanding silence, like a judge in full control of the courtroom. Enough, both of you! His voice sliced through the tension like a scalpel. Before this tears any more of you apart, you need to hear what Brianna left behind. He opened the manila envelope slowly, carefully, as if the pages inside might shatter from the weight of the words they carried. He pulled out several sheets of creamy stationery, each page thick and deliberate, like Brianna herself. She knew this moment would come, and she asked me to read these words aloud after her will was announced. Dustin sagged into his chair, his fury eclipsed by a terrible curiosity. I stayed frozen, too afraid to hope, but starving for any explanation that might untangle this unbearable knot. Dan cleared his throat and began, My dearest Jerry, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Dan's office, wondering if the world has lost its damn mind. I can picture your face, that confused, polite expression you used to get every time I rearranged the living room furniture without warning. You never did like surprises. Despite everything, I felt my lips twitch. That memory, so vivid, so her, landed like a phantom touch. She was in the room again. I know this inheritance must feel like a mistake, like something you didn't ask for and don't deserve. But Jerry, you're wrong. You deserve every penny, and I'm going to tell you why. Dan paused, lifted his eyes, held our gaze, then continued. I never stopped loving you, not during our worst fights, not during the divorce, not even during 15 years of stubborn silence. I was angry with you for not understanding my ambition, but I was angrier with myself for choosing that ambition over our marriage. You tried to save us, Jerry. You begged me to find balance, to remember what mattered, and I didn't listen. I was too proud, too afraid to slow down. Each sentence hit like a wave, relentless, undeniable, cleansing and cruel. I felt something break open inside me. Hot tears welled up, tears I hadn't let fall in 15 long years. Then, she said his name. Dustin? His head snapped up. The tension in the room shifted. My beautiful, brilliant boy. Dan's voice softened as the words came off the page. I know you're furious. I know you're convinced your father somehow manipulated me, that this is some betrayal. But sweetheart, you're not ready for this inheritance. Not yet. Dustin's face drained of color, then flushed red. Grief, rage, disbelief. His emotions cycled too fast to follow. You've lived your entire adult life in the shadow of my success, accepting the benefits without ever shouldering the burden. You never had to build anything from nothing. You've never faced the brutal decisions that wealth demands. Dan's voice was steady, but the words cracked like thunder. More importantly, you've spent 15 years hating a good man for crimes he never committed. "That's not true," Dustin whispered. But even he didn't believe it. Dan kept reading. Jerry taught me about character, about integrity, about a strength that doesn't come from judgment or cruelty, but from quiet consistency and self-respect. I forgot those lessons when I chose ambition over love. But I never forgot the man who taught them to my mom. I was crying now, openly, unashamed. Brianna's words weren't just apology, they were resurrection. A slow stitching back of everything her silence had torn apart. "Dustin, you've been given enough to live in comfort, enough to discover who you might be without the weight of unlimited wealth. Build something of your own, learn the value of people over profit, and forgive your father, not because he was perfect, but because he was human." Dustin made a sound, a strangled, broken noise, like a wounded animal. Whether it was grief or rage, I couldn't tell. Dan read on. "Jerry, you're inheriting more than money. You're inheriting the opportunity to do what I never had the courage to do, to use wealth as a tool for compassion, not as a weapon for pride. I trust you because you never wanted this, because I know you won't use it to hurt others, the way I sometimes did." The message continued for a few more paragraphs. Logistics, wishes, farewells. But the core truth had already landed. Brianna had chosen love over legacy, character over convenience, wisdom over wealth. When Dan finally stopped reading, the office fell into a silence so deep it felt sacred. I sat motionless, tears cooling on my cheeks, not just mourning but overwhelmed by the gift she had left me. Not the money, not the house, but the restoration of my worth. In her eyes, and maybe finally in my own. Dan folded the letter with care, slipped it back into the envelope, and offered it to me. "She wanted you to have the original." My hands trembled as I reached for it. The last conversation I'd ever have with the woman who had shaped my life in ways both beautiful and brutal. The weight of her words settled over the room like dust after a detonation. No one spoke, not for minutes. I held her letter against my chest, not as a symbol of victory, but as proof that healing can still come even at the end. Finally, Dustin broke the silence. His voice was low, empty. "This isn't over. I can contest this: mental incapacity, undue influence, fraud. There are ways to challenge a will." And for the first time since walking into Dan's office, I truly looked at my son. Not as a threat, not as a rival, but as a man who had just lost more than he knew how to bear. I looked at my son, really looked at him. A man who'd spent his entire life expecting the world to bend to his will, who still hadn't learned that love can't be inherited or demanded, only earned. "You could try," I said softly. "But your mother was right, Dustin. You're not ready for this responsibility." His laugh came sharp and bitter. "And you are. You're a nobody, Dad. A retired power plant worker with no business experience, no connections, no clue what it takes to run a multi-million-dollar company." For a flicker of a second, the old Jerry, the one who'd felt small for 22 years, wanted to nod. But then, Brianna's words returned. "You deserve every penny." "Maybe you're right," I said, rising slowly. "Maybe I don't know anything about running a company, but I do know something your mother valued even more." "What's that?" Dustin scoffed. "The difference between serving others and serving yourself." His face twisted, rage flashing one last time. "This is insane. She was sick. She was old. She wasn't thinking clearly." Dan's voice cut through, calm, crisp, and final. "Your mother was 62, in excellent health. She underwent psychological evaluation precisely to avoid the kind of challenge you're now threatening." Dustin's voice cracked. "Then why?" Like a boy abandoned. "Why would she do this to me?" I felt something shift, a flicker of compassion for the angry man in front of me. My son, still, no matter what. "She didn't do this to you, Dustin. She did it for you. She gave you the chance to figure out who you are when there's no inheritance propping you up." "I don't want that chance," he snapped, the words bursting loose, 15 years of entitlement breaking open. "I want what's mine." "What's rightfully yours," I said evenly. is $500,000 in a house worth almost $1 million, more than most people ever see. What you think you deserved was never really yours to begin with. He stared at me, long and hard, and I saw it. The moment he realized something fundamental had shifted. The man he'd mocked that morning, the father he'd dismissed as a failure, wasn't seeking his approval anymore. "You think you've won," he muttered, grabbing his coat, hands trembling. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" "No," I said, truth settling deep in my chest. "It makes me responsible." He hesitated at the door, seeming smaller than when he'd walked in. "This isn't finished." "Yes, it is." I met his eyes. No anger, just quiet finality. "It ended the moment your mother made her choice. The only thing left is what you do with the life she's still given you." He said nothing else, just walked out, the door closing behind him with a soft click, echoing louder than any slam. Dan began organizing papers on his desk, the soft rustle of documents grounding us back in reality. "There will be paperwork to finalize," Vantage said, "accounts to transfer, board meetings to schedule. The current management team is excellent. They'll help guide you through the transition." I nodded, still trying to absorb everything that had just happened. "Dan, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Did she really love me, even after all the things that went wrong between us?" Dan smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all day. "Jerry, every time we met, she talked about you. Not about the divorce, not the conflicts. She talked about the man who taught her that success without character is just expensive failure." I walked out of that office a different man than the one who had walked in. The afternoon sun felt warmer. The air, somehow cleaner. I had responsibilities now. Work to do, a company to understand and hopefully make better. But for the first time in 15 years, I felt worthy of the challenge. That's when I understood something. Justice isn't about revenge. It's not even about vindication. It's about recognition. The recognition that character matters more than credentials, that patience outlasts entitlement, and that love, real love, never truly dies. Brianna had seen all of that, and in her final act, she gave me the chance to prove she was right. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. To listen to the next story, click the box on the left. Thanks for watching.